Welcome to the Average Podcast, a space for deep reflection on violence and its aftermath, and a call to engage with the ongoing work of justice, memory, and repair. We are joined by Professor John Brewer, a leading sociologist who confronts the provocative question, why do people kill and die for religion? In this episode, he explores how monotheistic belief, when entangled with power and identity, can fuel violence, and why understanding the social conditions behind it matters now more than ever.
I'm going to talk today about why people kill and die for religion. And I will come up with an answer. People have done so throughout history and do so still today. Religious identity can be the main reason for the killings and deaths, as with the 6 million Jews who perished in the Nazi death camps. Men, women, children, old and young, whole families and generations killed simply for being Jewish. And religion can be the main, but not only constituent of the ethnic identity that encourages genocide. As with the killing up to the 8th of January this year of 46,000 Palestinians in the Gaza war. 8 out of 10 of which were civilian. 7 out of 10 of which were women and children. This compares with only 1,700 Israelis killed in the same period. Clearly, holocausts know no boundaries when motivated by religion. Some of the worst atrocities in human history involve religion as a motivating force. There is both despair and hope in monotheistic religion, with its ambivalence between peace and war. And in my new book, which Robert did the kindness of flagging, I look at both hope and despair, the scriptural support for peace within the midst of the practice of holy war. And this lecture is only about the despair side of this Janus face. I just want to pose 2 questions in my lecture today. Why is monotheistic religion so closely associated with violent conflict? And secondly, what happens to religion when it turns murderous? Now, in addressing the first question, I should explain that I do so as a sociologist. I am not going to talk about the religious motivations of individual perpetrators. This is the weakness of my disciplinary background. But to address some of the general features of monotheistic religion that inclines it towards despair. I will not, therefore, be addressing what drives some individual religious zealots to kill, but I do want to focus on the social conditions that can turn religion toxic and violent in certain circumstances. And this is the strength of my discipline. I want to stress 2 things about monotheism in answering the first question about its links with violence. First, monotheistic religion was born in violence. Polytheist sects in biblical Israel and in the Islamic world had first to be defeated in military struggle in order for monotheistic religion to dominate, including by both Muhammad as a warrior prophet and the Israelis under the command of Yahweh to smite the peoples of Canaan who occupied the land promised to Abraham. You only have to look at the book of Joshua to see the extent to which violence was perpetrated against the Canaanites. Christianity, growing out of monotheistic Judaism,
is the only religion that could emerge as fully monotheistic without the use of force. And secondly, I want to stress that monotheistic religion predisposes violence. Monotheism involves making and believing truth claims about the one God. The inherent tendency of each monotheistic faith to see itself as the one true religion, the font of all truth, can, among some believers, and I want to emphasize some, turn religious righteousness into self-righteousness. And the point about self-righteousness is the conviction of the untruth of others. Now, violent religious extremism took on a new phase with monotheism, precisely because monotheism inevitably discriminates between the righteousness of the true believer and the unrighteousness of the rest. Discrimination in belief and values can result in unbelievers being treated differently, facilitating the process which sociologists call othering, the drawing of boundaries around those considered an insider and an outsider. While these boundaries mostly remain solely moral, distinguishing between groups only by their different values and beliefs, the boundaries can also become social, political, and economic. And in this case, the religious other is subjected to structural disadvantage and inequality and political disempowerment and oppression, which can turn violent. Now, such systems of violent oppression are more likely to occur whenever religion and ethnic identity coincide, such that religion becomes associated with exclusive ethnic nationalism. Now, in such circumstances, religion can become wrapped up with both ethnic defense and ethnic expansionism, where religion is used by ethnic groups to defend their interests in a nationalist struggle of resistance or in a nationalist expansion and colonialism. Taken to extremes, the link between religion and nationalism can result in the elision of identity, religion, and territory. Now, this gives chosen people status to a religious group who become supposedly especially elected by God to inherit a land that is thought to be theirs by right of religious covenant. This, after all, is what the covenant with Abraham was all about. Afrikaners in South Africa, Jews in Israel, Protestants in Ulster, and the Pilgrim Fathers who colonized New England have all claimed chosen people status to give religious justification to their land grabbing. In this way, monotheistic religion is clearly wrapped up with the problem of large numbers, where religious majorities have the ability to impose exclusion on religious minorities in the form of persecution, competition, or indifference. Now, such intolerance naturally leads to othering. For religious minorities, for majorities to assert their religious differences in order to exclude minorities who do not belong. This othering of religious minorities can show itself in religious persecution and violence, but mostly it shows itself in neglect and indifference, not violence. Violent persecution is more likely to occur when the majority feels threatened and beleaguered, perhaps because of the size of the religious minorities, their political and cultural assertiveness, or their links to powerful diasporas abroad. Indifference is more likely to result when the majority is a settled community and there is no sense of threat. Throughout history, therefore, there have been many examples of religious extremism, now popularly called religious terrorism. Religious extremism is very rarely conducted under a fairness rule that respects the human dignity of others and treats unbelievers as moral beings. Thus, holy wars are notoriously aggressive, abusive, and violent. Indeed, holy wars can be particularly morally degrading in the abuses that they inflict on the human body of those who are deemed unelect, and particularly female bodies. And this is because the unelect can sometimes be morally enervated, stripped of moral worth and of any humanity. Now, this brings me to my second question. I have shown what happens to political conflict when it is given a religious hue, in terms of the dehumanizing depravity in acts of war, its religious motivations and justifications, and in the sacralization of its perpetrators, who are almost turned into sacred martyrs and heroes. However, I want to ask a different question. What happens to monotheistic religion when it turns murderous? Let me put that another way. In what ways is religion distorted by its politicization? Now, let me give you 8 effects. First, there are hermeneutical issues that affect the interpretation of religious texts, which weaponize scripture. And that can lead to the excision of peace-loving texts. Doctrine is given a political interpretation, with politics shaping the canonical emphases. Human rights abuses, slavery, apartheid, sectarianism, anti-Catholicism, Islamophobia have all been given scriptural support in the past. And doctrine is readily invoked in encouragement of political action. Biblical hermeneutics, after all, allowed at the same time Afro-American slaves in the USA to see in the book of Exodus their eventual liberation, and the Ku Klux Klan to find justification for lynching them. Secondly, religious beliefs and practice are politicized. Religion is mobilized to provide meaning, the motive, the moral justification for political action, giving theological and scriptural bases to courses of political action. And thirdly, the meaning of religion and religious identification is distorted. Religion becomes an expression of ethno-national identity, not an expression of faith. Faith commitment is wrapped up with political loyalty as a form of cultural religion, rather than a demonstration of personal faith. Cultural religion implicates an ethno-religious identity, which carries no obligation to practice, so that religion becomes as much an expression of cultural and political identity as a belief. We are not Christians, we're Protestants, was once the cry of loyalists in Northern Ireland. Fourthly, religion fragments. The chaos of political diversity affects the unity of religion as it fragments under denominational differences and doctrinal schisms that can represent as much political differences as religious ones. Sunni and Shia differences within Islam, for example, reflect nation-state allegiances as much as doctrinal disputes, pitting together the competing national interests of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Differences within Judaism often map onto political differences in Israeli society, particularly over whether or not the protection of human rights is an ancient Talmudic principle, a dispute that is critical today for the support that some Jews give to Palestinian rights and their opposition to the Gaza war. Fifthly, religion narrows in its form and nature in its search for religious and political authenticity. Fragmentation can cohere around narrower and ever more exclusive forms of religious belief and political position, with religious belief and behavior becoming stricter and the band of true believers ever smaller and narrower. Liberalization and secularization have lost religion its monopoly of moral discourse, and fragmentation can result in ever more exclusive forms of faithfulness and truth. Sixth, in situations of religious plurality, it is almost impossible to promote the privatization of religion. Religion goes public. Equality of religious practice and belief is easier to enact in societies where religion does not matter or not matter enough to want believers to have their beliefs count in public affairs. Cultural religion, however, politicized religion, it politicizes religion in the public sphere and makes religious pluralism almost impossible. Now, in such circumstances, monotheism returns as public religion. Now, this has the effect of pushing religion back into the public square, despite secularization, giving political debates a religious edge and simultaneously witnessing the sacralization of public space. Sacralized public space becomes a place for vituperative religious contestation, and this contestation can become violent. Cultural religion can, for example, proliferate hate crimes in public linked to religion. It can encourage into the public square various groups, normally hidden from it by their eccentricity, but now emboldened under a religious impulse. This could be white supremacists and their newfound evangelical zeal for Trump, they say is the new Messiah. It could be jihadists, now encouraged to fundamentalist violence in shopping malls and pop concerts, or Jewish settlers on the West Bank dismantling Palestinian villages and homesteads. Seventh, religious spaces become divided and partisan. Some religious spaces are out of bounds and are not seen as neutral and above the fray. Entering each other's religious spaces can become seen as a road leading to hell. And these religious spaces can become particular targets for those asserting competing religious faith and identities. Sunni and Shia extremists, for example, bomb each other's mosques. Now, this brings me to my final point, which acts as a conclusion to this lecture. In its tension between despair and hope, monotheism can become an obstacle to reconciliation, not a facilitator. It can be seen as part of the problem, not as part of the solution. Thus, religiously motivated fear, anxiety, hatred can inhibit, it can limit monotheism's avowal of hope, peace, and justice. Now, it is precisely this distortion of monotheism that results in what in my new book I call the paradox of monotheism. Violence corrupts monotheistic religion, and it becomes difficult for it also to be a site of reconciliation during and after conflict. And this this paradox constrains the potential for monotheistic peace building. However, the limits under which monotheistic peace building work in order to realize hope rather than despair has to be a topic for another lecture. But it is fully discussed in my book. Thank you very much.
Professor Brewer, thank you for a provocative piece. Certainly rattles the theological cage in the best possible way, of course. Among other things, your lecture raises the sober yet unsettling prospect that monotheistic religion, by virtue of its exclusivity, readily or perhaps easily lends itself to violent conflict. The argument proceeds from two main contentions. First, that monotheism is born of violence, and second, that it inevitably engenders practice of othering that can escalate into grave atrocities. Although this sociological analysis provides valuable insights, it also creates an opportunity for us to push ourselves to understand what is truly at stake. After all, the devil is in the detail. Indeed, a richer perspective emerges when engaging a broader range of thinkers, particularly those in theology and philosophy, reflecting my positionality as a respondent. In this sense, much of our work is premised on the idea that religious violence is driven not merely by monotheism, this would be far too simplistic, but often by wider socio-political forces. And let me just explain. Now, the lecture traces monotheism back to a formative struggle that allegedly purged polytheism and cemented a single all-powerful God. This echoes Jan Assmann's notion that monotheism introduced a question of truth into religion, forcing an either-or choice that can become unforgiving. Yet, it bears noting that Assmann himself carefully distinguishes between the concept of religious exclusivity and its politicized expression. Monotheistic beliefs, though certainly capable of polarizing, do not automatically breed violence. Indeed, as Immanuel Kant observes, religion can serve as a marker of communal identity and thereby become a vector of conflict, but only under specific societal conditions. In other words, exclusivity in principle is not necessarily the same as unleashing violence in practice. Today, we also heard that monotheism facilitates othering, especially when harnessed by ethnic or nationalist movements. It is certainly true that religion can be conscripted into nationalist projects. Thomas Hobbes, for example, makes the point that governments and insurgent movements have historically used religion to cement legitimacy and rally supporters. David Martin likewise argues that religion becomes virtually coextensive with society and saturates the public sphere. It risks fueling power struggles. Under these conditions, even a benign creed and its associated hallelujahs can morph into a tool of aggression. However, a simplistic focus on monotheism neglects the roles of, for example, race, land or territory, economics, resentment, and the thirst for political power, factors that often shape violence more than any scriptural dogma. In this context, a more productive undertaking discerns the difference between inclusive and exclusive nationalism. The lecture rightly laments chosen people or the chosen people rhetoric that merges monotheistic faith with expansionist or ethnic superiority. Yet this phenomenon points less to monotheism's alleged core disposition than to the fusion of religion with what might be called exclusive nationalism, a universal monotheistic principle, belief in one God who is creator of all, naturally inclines toward a transcendent moral code that addresses all human beings equally. But when such faith is fastened into tribal interest, it deteriorates in what we label henotheism, one's own God for one's own nation, overshadowing any universal ethic. Under these conditions, religion is weaponized. What should be a unifying moral framework devolves into a justification for oppression or warfare. This distinction helps pass the claim that monotheism is predisposed to violence. Historically, many monotheistic communities have indeed committed egregious acts, but so too have avowedly secular and polytheistic groups once they embraced a brand of exclusive nationalism or totalitarian rule. Kant's caution that religion might bring with them pretext for war applies equally to ideological movements that wield iron-fisted truth claims in the secular realm. Hence, the challenge is not monotheism alone, but any system, religious or not, that denies freedom, pluralism, and universal moral obligations. Yet it would be an oversimplification to suggest that every form of nationalism is necessarily destructive. Some have argued for a more inclusive nationalism, one that respects the boundaries of collective identity while maintaining a universal moral commitment to human dignity, where religion remains cognizant of its own transcendent horizon. It can foster solidarity that transcends mere tribal loyalties. Indeed, multiple faith traditions have proven capable of standing up to oppressive regimes and amplifying voices demanding justice. In these instances, monotheism's emphasis on a single God who value all creation militates against in-group favoritism. We can agree, of course, that monotheism can fragment into dogmatic schisms, distort sacred texts, and sanctify armed conflict. History is littered with these examples, yet, as Hobbes advises, the real culprit often lies in how religious elites and political powers manipulate faith. In principle, monotheism can champion the dignity of all human beings, the universal moral commitment, and thereby restrain violence rather than provoke it. Take, for example, contexts where Christians, Jews, or Muslims have been at the forefront of social justice and peace movements. Their monotheistic convictions motivated them to protest against dehumanizing policies, not to further them. That these same religions also show up in violent conflicts illuminates the dual potential, as you pointed out, of religious identity. Far from monotheism being uniquely violent, it is human agency, whether shaped by nationalism, power struggles, or social anxieties, that propels monotheism toward aggression or peace. In short, the cautionary remark about monotheistic ideas, the certainty of possessing divine truth, the impulse to smite one's enemies ring true because they can prove combustible. One might add that the whole "my God is superior to your God" issue is a lot like a bunch of rugby supporters squabbling over who's got the best rugby team. The difference is, of course, Professor Brewer, is that in rugby, you're more likely to deal with the reality that Ireland has never gone beyond a Rugby World Cup quarterfinal than any army on your doorstep. But precisely because monotheism rests on the premise of one God for all creation, it also provides an inclusive moral vision that can undermine rather than reinforce violent chauvinism. The question is whether believers adopt that inclusive vision or distort it as a blunt political instrument. One can see how interpretive voices about sacred texts, about divine will, make all the difference. Throughout history, voices have emerged from within monotheistic communities insisting that the creator of all demands justice, mercy, and commitment to the stranger and the outsider. These interpretive threads remind us that in many instances, the impetus for peace has come from the very same text used by others to defend conflict. Indeed, if the deep logic of monotheism extends to universal ethics, then the real battle between those who hold fast to that universality and those who twist religion to serve exclusivist aims. Nevertheless, the sociological framework here opens valuable lines of inquiry about how religion, once entangled in identity politics, can provoke lethal conflict. Still, the likes of Assmann, Martin, Hobbes, and Kant remind us that monotheism, rightly conceived, need not degenerate into exclusivist violence. The crucial factor is the extent to which religious conviction is pressed into the service of unfettered nationalism or parochial power. Recognizing this interplay helps us move beyond deterministic views of monotheism as violent. Indeed, if a universal monotheistic ethic instructs us to love our neighbors, even the ones cheering for rival rugby teams or worshipping in different pews, then we would do well to recall that religious violence often betrays a tradition's highest claims rather than fueling them. To paraphrase a modern wit, simply brandishing a knopkierie or a wooden club as theological does not mean one is playing by the rules of the game. The future challenge is thus to harness monotheism's moral capacity, to foster inclusivity, and to guard against political exploitation. The cautionary note stands, but the remedy is equally clear. Monotheism must cling to its universalist horizon, lest it devolve into henotheistic tribalism. The fate of peace in many parts of the world may very well hinge on that distinction. Ultimately, the single most memorable point is this: monotheism does not have to be violent. While it can be manipulated to serve exclusionary or nationalistic ends, it likewise contains the theological resources to defend human dignity and to challenge oppression. That dual potential places responsibility squarely on both religious leaders and the broader society. If the universal God is truly the God for all, then any claim to divine favor cannot remain the sole property of one group against another. This simple yet profound insight should guide how we approach religious belief in public life, ensuring that shared moral commitments outshine narrow partisan allegiances, and that faith never becomes a blunt instrument of division. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Demaine, also for bringing further insights, but also questions to the fore. So, John, I don't know if you'd like to respond immediately to what Demaine has said, and then after that we can take some questions from the floor.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that. I have to say I agree with what you said. What I tried to do was to articulate the social conditions under which monotheism is used to kill. I do think that there are features about monotheism that enable people to use it to kill, but it's the social conditions within which religion is used that turn it murderous. That is the strength of my discipline of sociology and also its weakness. I share with you too the view that religious violence has an air of myth about it. What is mythological is not the violence, but that it is religious. Most conflicts are political in substance, but some of those conflicts can be experienced as religious, despite the fact that the substance is thoroughly political. And they can be experienced as religious under specific social conditions. The conflict might well be between groups who are identified by their religion. Religious rhetoric can be used by political actors to give the conflict a particular color and hue. Indeed, religious actors can participate in the conflict. So under certain circumstances, political conflicts can be both political and religious. I come from Northern Ireland, and therefore I'm inclined to such a view. So I agree entirely with you. It is the social conditions that turn monotheistic religion murderous. And our task as sociologists is to identify what precisely those conditions are. But I do stand by my claim that there are features about monotheism that facilitate othering. But it is the othering that causes the conflict, not a monotheism. And indeed, were I to have given a lecture on the hope side of this Janus phase, you and I would agreed even further about the tendency for religion to offer hope, peace, and justice. After all, there's 400 verses in Christian scripture that use peace. Jesus is described as the Prince of Peace. Peacemakers are described by Jesus as especially blessed. But this creates the paradox, does it not? A monotheistic religion in which God is benign and loving, understood using the analogy of a parent. Yet that same benign, loving, all-powerful, omnipotent God cannot or does not stop people invoking his name, or her name, depending on what theology you believe in. Does not stop people invoking his name to commit some of the most morally depraved acts of violence. And that's the paradox. And it's that paradox that I use to explain why it is that monotheistic peace building starts from such a problematic point. So it's the hope side of the Janus phase that I think is in fact the most important part of that book.
Thank you very much for that clear response, John. We can open the floor for some questions now. So indication, let's take 2 or 3 questions, and then John, if you can again respond to them together.
Hi, I'm Viren Naika. I'm from Averick. This is more comment, and I'm listening to this and thinking about it philosophically in some way, and I'm very much wondering, listening to the both of you talk, if you think a post-secular or post-religious society is truly possible. Very much thinking of Carl Schmitt's political theology and his idea that all secular concepts are really just inherited and transformed religious concepts. I mean, even our notions of guilt in courts of law and etc. are predicated on very old ancient Christian ideas. So, I mean, this is kind of why monotheism would continue to be intrinsic to peace building, right? In South Africa, we can kind of see those tensions because we have a secular state now. We have a separation between church and state since '94. South African society is still some of the most religious society in the world, and that has implications for women, minorities, etc. So, and the reason I'm saying this is because, you know, Valentin Ives Mudimbe writes The Invention of Africa in 1981, and one of the things he says is, you know, if you want to really explain colonialism in Africa, you don't go back to capitalism, you actually go back to the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery, because that justifies people coming into Africa and taking land. And in the 1913 Land Act is very much a replication of that. You know, Africans or people who are not Christian cannot own land. So what I'm trying to say is very much these metaphorical systems are built into one another, and the idea of adjudicating things from a secular or neutral standpoint actually becomes increasingly difficult if we look at these things. Thank you.
See, I think, again, sociologically, there are distinct cultural, political, and social conditions under which religious peace building emerged in the 1990s, and why it is particularly associated with and developed in the United States. And it's worth understanding those conditions in order to see the context within which religious peace building, monotheistic peace building is being pushed. The 1990s saw the re-emergence of religious holy wars in Europe. It also was a context in which we saw the fall of communism. America emerged as the last great power standing. There was almost a sense of triumphalism. The West had won. And America under Clinton sought to universalize democracy as the solution to world conflicts. And America became very interventionist. And in as much as some of those conflicts were religious in experience, some were both religious and political, you suddenly got the emergence of ideas around the role of religion and diplomacy. You've got the emergence of a series of centers at leading US universities focused upon religion and diplomacy, religion and peace building, religion and conflict. You had big research grants given. We had the emergence of professionals, often leading these research centers, that were addressing religious peace building as the new solution. We all know, I think one of the features that interests me particularly is the separation of church and state in the US, which makes religious heterodoxy the right for your religious beliefs to count. Why US politicians wear their religion on their sleeves. In Europe, given the closeness of church and state, heterodoxy is the right not to believe or to believe something entirely different, which means you privatize your religion. You don't bring it into the public square. Whereas in the US, you do bring it into the public square. And that's another reason why religious peace building became fashionable. Now, what I've tried to do is to understand why it is that religious peace building often does not work, why it is rejected by many of the, let's call them, peace professionals. And what I've tried to do after that is to understand the way in which we might build a bridge between secular professional peace builders and those with faith who have a scriptural commitment to enact monotheistic beliefs about peace, justice, and equality. And so the book goes on to understand the social conditions under which religious peace building emerge, its unpopularity, and yet the way in which we might build a bridge so that those who are committed to peace building as a result of faith in whatever Abrahamic monotheistic religion we're talking about can at least start to make a difference.
We've got time for maybe one or two questions. I see a hand there. We also have an online question from Mawetu, mate.
Hi, this is Mawetu. I just typed my comment on the chat. My thing is, I'm thinking of the role of religion in modern day society. I'm thinking of the value of diversity that I think is very crucial in modern day society, as it promotes more inclusive and equitable communities that are vibrant, that are innovative. It promotes understanding of different perspectives. I think, modern day society are striving because of, this value. But I'm saying the same cannot be said for monotheistic religions, as it limits diversity from the very definition of there can only be one, and then diversity or differences follows after that understanding and acceptance of there can only be one. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much, Mawetu, for that. And let's take a last question then.
I think the reason people like monotheism, which is a single religion, is because people like story. People like a simple story, even though the story may be wrong or maybe not true and so on. And I always feel that a story told by 1,000 people for 1 month is still a story, but a story told by billions of people for 1,000 years become a religion. So, for example, I'm a scientist, and I just take the example of atomic weapon, like Oppenheimer's story of atomic, for example. If you explain to the people about the chain reaction, the nuclear fusion, how derive energy from nuclear fusion to turn hydrogen and helium into lithium, to all the way to oxygen, etc., very few people understand it, and they won't follow you. But if you tell people a story that our nation is under emergency, if we don't do it, the Nazi will do it. That's a story we hear in Oppenheimer. And that's people like this story, and they will propel it. They will gather enough consensus to build it. For example, the reason South Africa didn't build atomic weapon is because our neighbors were all weak. Suppose our neighbors, Namibia or somewhere else, is really strong and threaten us. I guarantee you South Africa will have the atomic weapon probably in 3 or 5 years' time. So I think people like story, and it is that reason that many people stay in this monotheism, etc., and then follow the dogma which you have just described.
Thank you very much for that. Let's then conclude. Demaine, maybe you can, if you want to make a brief comment, and then over to you, John.
Thank you. I think just one quick thing. I think it's clear that what you refer to as the paradox of monotheistic faith. Of course, that is indeed something that should be taken seriously, and I think most theologians would not disagree with with that take. But I think where I've am a little bit concerned, and perhaps where I want to vent some ideas that is part and parcel of the Christian faith, as in terms of my positionality. I think the liberatory aspects of if you think about liberation theology, for example, for me that seems to be lacking, and for me it almost feels like monotheistic faiths. The faith traditions itself is quite complex, and to deal with issues of faith in with that broad sweep, I find somewhat problematic, and that's why I said the devil is oftentimes in the detail when when assessing exactly what is at stake. So I think that we need to address, and of course, as a sociologist, you would need to engage the theologians and the scholars of religion to at least be able to come to terms with the complexity associated with that. It's not as if, as theologians, we are not grappling, amongst ourselves in terms of clarity. So I think at the very least, this notion of trans and interdisciplinarity that we talk about in scholarship is something that we need to take seriously. And with that, I mean, I have very little interest in coming up or protecting or act as a vanguard for faith. I think the shortcomings in any religious faith should be pointed out, because I think at the end of the day, we've got a long history of problematics associated with that. So I think just we need to balance it out somewhat more. Thanks.
I couldn't help but contrast what was said there with your question. You see monotheism as simple. You described it as complex. I can't help but interject a third person, Donald Trump. Trump offers simple solutions to simple minds for complex problems. It's simplicity that matters. Trump is coming up against, however, the fact that problems are exceedingly complex. He's not solved the Gaza war. He's not solved the Ukraine war. I think he said in 24 hours. He might have said 36, I don't know. The world is complex, and simple solutions for simple minds don't work. But I can understand why it is that monotheism might be perceived as simple, because it offers one benign, omnipotent God who explains the rest of the world, the whole of the world, for us. But the implementation of that is entirely and completely complex. And I wouldn't myself describe monotheism as simplistic at all. But I come back to my main point. It reflects the question on online. One of the things practicing people of faith have to confront is that we live in a liberal, secular world. Faith is not popular. Faith is often rejected. People with faith can often be humiliated and criticized. How then can we make religious peace building work in a secular world? That was what I'm trying to address in that book. And particularly, how can we make it work when there is such a link between religion and violence that can make people think that religion is the problem, not the solution, that religion is the cause of the human rights abuses that professional peace builders have to ameliorate. And that is my dilemma. That is what I've tried to address. How can we make monotheistic peace building work in a secular world where people of faith are marginalized and in a world where religion is so associated with violence? How can we make it work? I end that book with some recommendations as to how both people of faith might move forward and how secular, liberal, professional peace builders might begin to take religious peace building more seriously.
Thank you for listening to the AVRIC podcast. For more insights, research, and reflections, visit our website or follow us online and join the reparative journey.